A strong curriculum is one that is balanced and includes both of these for every student. According to her, curriculum serves as a mirror when it reflects individuals and their experiences back to themselves. And I quote, "Seeing their identities mirrored in text can foster positive social identity development in students by increasing their pride, confidence, and healthy self-esteem. At the same time, that same curriculum can serve as a window when it introduces and provides the opportunity to understand the experiences and perspectives of those who possess different identities." And I quote again, "Viewing a text as a window allows students to explore the lived experiences of others, building empathy and understanding while examining diversity in social, cultural, political, and historical contexts. Using this approach, students gain a more complex and authentic understanding of the world around them, which results in respectful behavior toward others, development of critical thinking skills, and an interest in issues of social justice." So I want to thank you for your efforts to provide both mirrors and windows for all of the kids in our district. And as a church person, I enthusiastically applaud your desire to make our schools welcoming and safe places for all of our kids. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Jennifer Babcock, followed by Charlie Eastham.
My name is Jennifer Babcock, and my children just finished 6th grade at Penn Elementary. I would like to take an informal vote and ask for a show of hands. How many here feel that an autistic student has a right to be treated with respect and dignity in their own classroom? I ask this because on World Autism Day, my autistic daughter was treated with discrimination when her teacher called her class to a vote on whether my daughter was being a disruption to the class by using her stress ball. My daughter is different, but not less than her peers. In some ways, she is exceptional to her peers. My autistic daughter has been learning about the neurodiversity movement and has begun to learn basic self-advocacy and, more importantly, pride in how her brain is different and experience of the world is unique as opposed to wrong or diseased. On the particular day of this incident, my daughter was hyper-focused on the information the school was promoting to her peers about autism. She was understandably anxious, and so much of what is promoted about autism is painted as a tragedy and a burden to the rest of society. And what she wanted very much was to challenge this paradigm. She was successful in doing so. In her art class, she taught her teacher about the rainbow infinity symbol used by the neurodiversity movement, and talked to some of her peers about how puzzle piece symbolism is considered dehumanizing to autistics. Unfortunately, in her homeroom class, she was less successful. Her teacher decided to show the class a film about autism, and this made her very anxious. She began squeezing and tossing her stress ball while focusing on the content of the video. This bothered her teacher, who has known that during times of high anxiety, my daughter will resort to stimming activities to regulate stress. I would also like to mention at this point that my daughter was under a 504 plan that has been repeatedly not followed during the year. In that 504 plan, we had accommodations for stimming as well as dealing with redirection privately. Instead of following the 504 plan and treating my autistic daughter with dignity, her teacher publicly humiliated and shamed her in front of her peers for her differences on a day that the world was trying to promote acceptance and inclusion for all autistics. This act was an act of hatred and intolerance that caused my daughter further harm by increasing her anxiety. This is a teacher that was just weeks later given a District Shine Award. This is unacceptable. I have already emailed you board members about this so you are aware. The school is aware, the district administration has been made aware, as well as the equity director. I have already talked to many of you about the ongoing treatment my daughter experienced over years at her elementary school by peers and staff due to the climate there that I believe is the result of head administration in that school. It is time for a change. This type of hatred towards students with differences needs to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Charlie Eastham, followed by Lucas Van Orten.
Thank you, President Goodwin. My name is Charlie Eastham. I live at 953 Canton Street in Iowa City. I wanted to talk about two things. One, I just want to really support the LGBTQ students in the district, and would ask the board to consider ways to not subject them to harassment by speakers coming up here to address you. I don't think you have to. I think you have to listen to them. I don't think the students in the district have to be subjected to their assaults. I also want to talk about the situation of principals in the district, principals of color. As you know, in the last 2 years, we have lost 2 principals of color in the district, and under circumstances which, as I understand, have been very problematic. I hope we can, you can, I think, I would say, I hope we can come up with a better way of maintaining principals of color that we bring into the district so that they can stay here and have long and stellar professional careers. That has not been the case in the past. I know all of you know this. I'm not quite sure what institutional change has to be considered by the board. I suppose you could say, well, we're going to, for the time being, we're going to assess whether or not a principal of color is going to be extended, their contract's going to be extended for another year in their school. I know the board's not supposed to be involved heavily in personnel issues, but the way we're doing it right now is not resulting in long tenure of principals of color. So I hope we will continue. You will find a way to remedy this. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Lucas, followed by Sarah Barron.
Good evening, folks. Lucas Van Orden, 3121 Pond Lane. Every now and then I pop by to say hello. This is one of those times. Actually, I have 2 things I want to visit with you on. I want to talk a little bit about Brian Kirschling's letter to the Press Citizen, which eventually got printed. And thank you all for accelerating the build. Not an easy decision to make, not one that should be made hastily. Can appreciate the fact that when the question was first raised before the board, there was sort of a pause and said, you know what, these couple projects, yes, and let's think about this in about 6 months. That's good governance. That is not responding to a public outcry or a pressure, but saying, you know what, as a board, you're going to meet with your staff and you're going to make good, thoughtful decisions. And I believe you came to one, and I thank you for the vote that you did. Phil, I appreciate the fact you voted against it. That's cool. That's why we have votes. And I respect the fact that you respectfully disagree. No worries. Assuming Steve's around somewhere, you will have your superintendent executive review for him in closed session later. I want to offer a voice that you have an excellent administrative staff. It starts with Steve, and it goes to the people who sit behind me and the people who come in and work every day in the district. I have occasion as a consumer of the Iowa City Community School District education product to reach out and ask a question or ask for a resource, and I find that your staff across the board is prompt, courteous, and professional. I do want to briefly kind of hijack, pardon me for a sec. When you've got a situation in a school where something screws up and a teacher takes a vote or whatever happens to be, deal with it. Deal with it appropriately, but it does not necessarily have to be a case where it is endemic of the whole. I believe as a whole, the Iowa City Community School District does a fine job, and I believe you have an excellent administrative staff, and I do believe they take that leadership from Steve, who, Lori, you and Phil, last time contract negotiations were up in the fall of 16, voted against salary increase. Cool. I appreciate the fact that you had budgetary concern. The one thing I have found about Steve that I find interesting is that I have never seen a person who is more resilient to public pressure and takes it as he does because he should, it's part of his job, and then he moves forward. I believe he gives good guidance to his administrative staff, This is typical of the pushback in the fall, is accelerating the build. $15 million savings, thank you. Put that money to good use. Put it to special ed. You have a number of people in this building who see the whole picture behind the scene. That lady right there is probably the best in the building I know to see all sides of the picture. And there is far more that goes on. It's very complex. There are incredibly complex moving parts. And the Carol DeProsses and the editorial board thrashing that the board and the administrative team gets is seldom validated with a objective evaluation of facts, all the facts. So as you go into your superintendent review, my one request for you is to ask, as a board, what have you done to provide the support and guidance for your administrative team for them to be able to execute your guidance? That'd be my ask for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas. Sarah, followed by Julie Van Dyke.
Hi, y'all. I am a friendly local queer, Sarah Barron, and I'm here to talk to you a bit about tolerance. At your last couple of meetings, you heard from members of the community about LGBTQ tolerance in our schools and the impact that it might have on them. So I'd like to go through a short list of things that we, the collective we, have tolerated from our schools. Letters home that have been addressed to mom and dad when dear families would have sufficed. Being told by a classmate that having same-sex parents means you're going to be gay too. The indignity and fear of not having a safe bathroom to use. Not having a gender and sexuality inclusive health or sexual development discussion in your personal development classrooms. Fear of bringing family photos to school for student of the week activities. Having teachers and volunteer adults in our classrooms who think that our families are broken or sinful or not worthy of recognition. Fear of telling adults and children at our schools about our marriages, our families, the birth of our children. Slurs about our sexual orientation and or gender identity from between peers, from student to staff member, or even school staff to student. Misgendering, having to choose between gendered outfits for school activities, and heteronormativity in activities like arts and theater, places where even way back in my day, LGBTQ students sought refuge. We have tolerated all these things and more, not because we like them, but because we recognize that school is an institution, like many others, that can be slow to catch up, and we know that not everyone views these hardships as personally and as directly as we do. One speaker at the last meeting spoke about Black students and asked why we would talk about LGBTQ issues when the challenges facing Black students require more attention, and that's, I'll just say it, ridiculous. Most of you have seen me here talking about the urgency of our racial equity issues. I'll add that I've never seen the last meeting speaker here do the same. I'll also point out another thing that should be obvious, which is that Black students and LGBTQ students are overlapping groups. If you want to improve conditions for Black students, you'd better acknowledge that some of them are LGBTQ too. Finally, at the last meeting, you also heard from bigot Ann Staley, who proudly introduced herself as a former ICCSD teacher and a current volunteer. The thought that she could be working with my children makes me ill, and there's nothing that I can do to protect them or other students from her and others like her, and I guess I'll be asked to tolerate that too. But what I won't tolerate is a public school system that marginalizes my children, my wife, and all the others who are part of this district living in the LGBTQ rainbow. So thank you for affirming our right to exist and be seen in the public schools, but I'm angry that because of bigots like Ann Staley, you have to. I'm going to continue speaking up for all those who have been left behind and left out of our schools for many often intersecting identities, students, staff, and leaders of color whom we are failing, girls and Black girls in particular who are harassed by our dress codes, Muslim and Jewish families whose holy days go unacknowledged, neurodiverse students and other individuals who can't fully access public spaces because those spaces are deficient, and yes, LGBTQ families and students who deserve full inclusion too. And so finally, I'd like to thank the people who have been speaking at these meetings against LGBTQ inclusion for reminding me that sometimes, as they say, tolerance does go too far. I'm no longer willing to tolerate their hate and their discrimination, no longer willing to let it go unnamed and unaddressed. And I hope that this board will join me in making it clear that we are just not going to tolerate that anymore. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Julie Van Dyke, followed by Lisa Ann Johnson.
On the fly, as usual, too much to do. I attended the board retreat recently, an exercise in bullying, after you all received a bullying communication implicating a 30-year Johnson County deputy sheriff and a fine Democratic Iowa senator, in addition to other legislators who had actually been on the Clear Creek Amana board for many years for the, oh my goodness, working to get us FFA in the schools. How unreasonable. I would point out that communication was really outrageous because throughout it's saying that a board member released protected information by IAC law, and yet how is it that a member of the public was given that information and able to write such a letter and promise such evidence if that was not public information? If it wasn't public, how come she got it? I would note that this district uses IAC as a shield, while it has in the past received a failing grade by the Iowa Transparency Board for actually providing the board itself open records request. When R. Chase Ramey was here, who's coming back, I see. Mr. Murley, his name is on the lawsuit in the Iowa courts online because the district lost a lawsuit over open records request after failing to provide open records to Ed Stone. You seem to pick and choose your IAC to interpret it to excuse the district from things that you don't want us to see. I might point out that the board retreat meeting minutes were not provided online for this meeting. What you hiding there? You bullying someone? Because I think you are. Open records requests are really interesting. My first one was actually guided by Steve Murley, and what he wanted me to do was to protect him from a board president and vice president at the time who he felt were attacking him. And he guided me by emails, which I still have, and over the phone. He gave me the subject and topic of the email. Before I even submitted my open records request, it was about the $60,000 plus unbid contract with Sinese Audit to come in that he just kind of asked around about. Phil and I were at those meetings when he talked about it. He provided that email. He read it to me over the phone before I ever even submitted the request. And then afterwards, after R. Chase Ramey came back and didn't want that stuff out there, he threatened me over that email. He threatened me if I showed or spoke about that email with anybody, an open record that I had received from the district and been read online or over the phone after he called me late at night to read it to me to help him out. I'm really concerned about R. Chase Ramey coming back here when we've just screwed over our two black principals, and I'd like to know why we keep creating one more highly paid position at the ESC after another when you're all so concerned about the small amount of funding that FFA is and other things. Why are we creating more positions? Why is it a white man? Why wasn't that job how many people of color were interviewed for that job? Before you vote to approve that, you should know those questions. You should also know that he consulted for the same company, the same owners of Sinese under and ProAct Search, which hired Kingsley and got a fat finder's fee, that those companies were owned by the Supes, and both he and Mr. Ramey and Steve Murley have consulted for those companies. You are so past needing a nepotism and conflict of interest policy that it's a joke. And if you hire this white man who's friends with people here and give him over $160,000 salary for a position that hasn't even been justified without having bothered to interview any people of color or fly that position around after you just screwed over our two black principals who were excellent, I may add, and stop trying to tell us it was a promotion. You get a promotion when you apply for it or you ask for it, not when you get shoved out of the school you've been running beautifully for several years.
Up next, Lisa Ann Johnson, followed by Billy Townsend.
Good evening. My name is Lisa Ann Johnson. I live on Kirkwood Avenue in Iowa City. I'm here to publicly support the LGBTQ task force recommendations. And I need to voice my support by reading my comments so I can get through this without crying. Already started. But in case I start to break down, my wife Heather is here to support me. I am a special education teacher for the district going on 15 years, and we are queer parents who will send our child to 3-year-old preschool in the fall. As a parent and a staff member, I am outraged at the anti-LGBT public comments and the perception that this is a non-issue because there isn't anything in front of you that you're adopting or looking at, to which I ask, why not? For all the talk of creating safe, supportive, and inclusive school environments, we need to go beyond a well-written statement of inclusion. We have staff and students who don't feel supported or safe in our schools, and given the high rates of suicide and depression among students who identify as LGBTQ, I ask again, why don't you have something in front of you? What are the short and long-term action steps that address the task force recommendations? I make a conscious decision to refer to my wife as my wife, not my partner, spouse, or significant other, but my wife, Heather. And I do this as a colleague told me that they didn't feel comfortable sharing they were in a committed relationship with a same-sex partner. They were worried about controversy, the potential disapproval from some parents and volunteers, and ultimately of not being supported. They were worried about having a photo of their significant other on their desk. A photo. While this is their decision to make, our straight colleagues openly share about their personal lives without hesitation. They have multiple framed family photos at their desk and will unflinchingly ask me, "Are you married? What does your husband do?" For the LGBT staff in our district, celebrating engagements, baby showers, or having their spouse and families attend school events can be controversial simply because they are gay, lesbian, or queer. Our LGBTQ youth, and especially our LGBTQ youth of color, do not see images of themselves represented in the materials they are assigned in class, in the materials in our libraries, on posters in hallways, or in the teaching staff in whom they are asked to go to for help and support. How is this reflective of a school environment inclusive of all families? I humbly share this quote from phenomenal Angela Y. Davis. "I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. And I won't accept the heteronormative status quo or accept as good enough that only 53% of our students who identify as non-binary and 67% of our LGB youth feel safe at school. I'm standing up to the speakers who insist that our LGBTQ youth represent a small minority, so we shouldn't focus on our efforts on creating inclusive schools. And I am standing up for myself and other individuals who are LGBTQ. We have a right to be visible, valued, and safe from bullying and harassment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Good afternoon. My name is Billy Townsend. I'm at 713 Whiting Avenue, Iowa City, Iowa. I have 3 grandchildren in the Iowa City School District. My son, when I moved here almost 30 years ago, was at Shimmick. At that time, I can think of several African-American teachers that were in the district, all who since have retired, including Marion Coleman and Barbara Hawk, and just to name a few. I'm kind of out of the system now, except for my grandchildren, who I still try to keep my hands on. And I'm wondering why last year when you brought the 2 new principals in, we had the reception. I was really excited about seeing finally some color in the district that were past the level of teacher. And then to hear that they're both gone for whatever reason, and there's also an assistant principal that's no longer in the system, I understand. But then when I looked at some information that I received recently, your equity committee has decided you're going to have 20% minorities, administrators, and teachers in the district. My concern is that after you recruit these African Americans or minorities, administrators and teachers, what are you going to do with them? How are you going to support them? How are you going to bring them into the fold? Because Iowa City is different. I'm from St. Louis. When I came here, it was a shock. But I worked for the university for almost 30 years, and the same thing has happened there. They recruit these wonderful teachers and these wonderful administrators. They bring them here, they give them these wonderful stories about inclusiveness and supportiveness, and they bring them here and they let them fail. Or they fail in our eyes as Iowans. So my question is, what are you going to do after you bring them in? Are you going to give them the support they need? Are you going to let principals be principals, teachers be teachers, staff be staff, administrators be administrators? By that I mean, there's certain things teachers do, certain things principals do, certain things administrators do. And the superintendent should be the one that's kind of got the pulse of all of it. So my question is, what are you going to do before you bring these people in? Are you going to give them the support they need? As a citizen and as a member of the, Black Voices group, I'm going to be watching to see what happens when you get this 20% minorities, teachers and administrators in. And I'm hoping that you'll reach out at least to the Black Voices Committee if you need help with retention. I think that's the problem. We can recruit people every day, but it's very hard to retain them in this community. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up on the agenda is to approve our agenda for tonight. I would like to propose a couple of modifications to the agenda. I believe we've got some students here interested in the dress code item, and I would suggest that we move that discussion item up directly following the public hearing. And then I would also like to suggest that the presentation portion of the agenda follow the dress code item, because we've got some time constraints for some of the presenters, and would suggest that we basically do that backwards, start with the policy review, employee hiring practices, school safety update, and then the equity committee. Any objections to those shifts?
No, that sounds good.
Is there a motion to approve the modified agenda? So moved.
Second?
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. Consent agenda. Phil, first you want to review the bills?
Yeah. We had $4.6 million worth of bills, $2.3 million in GO bonds, a lot of mileage reimbursements for teachers and staff that taking care of that, but everything looked in order when I went through. Thank you.
I'd like to pull the personnel item.
And I would like to pull 13 and 14 together and 15.
I move that we approve the consent agenda minus items 5, 13, 14, and 15.
Second?
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Okay, personnel item.
So the reason I wish to have this pulled is because I will be voting no on it. I want to note, however, that my no vote pertains only to one of the personnel hires on the list, and I am in support of all the other personnel changes that are on the list. I am voting no to the assistant superintendent for HR hire, and one of the reasons that I'm voting no on this is because I do not support doubling up on the assistant superintendents for HR for a whole year with a combined salary of over $320,000. I've heard the justifications for doing it. However, I just, from my perspective, in this day of a low allowable growth in state funding, I feel that I can't support overlapping this position to the tune of $160,000 for a whole year. Later in our meeting, we're going to be talking about class sizes, and I would like to see that money spent instead on teachers. That could give us at least 2 teachers, if not more, and therefore I will be voting no.
I would echo everything that Lori said, and there's other concerns I have with this that I won't go into that would be prejudicial or anything of that at that point. But I echo what Lori had mentioned. I think she was right on. Thank you. I'll be voting no.
Any other comments? I think for me, I will be voting yes. I think our board's job is to provide goals for the district through our own goals and goals for the superintendent. It's the superintendent's job to make choices to live up to those goals. And if he makes choices that interfere with the ability to hit his particular goals for the district, then we hold him accountable. I don't think it's the board's position to get in and micromanage hiring decisions. So I will be voting yes. Any further comments? Is there a motion to,
I move we approve the personnel.
Second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with Directors Ressler, Godwin, Malone, and Eystone voting yea and Directors Rotland and Hemingway voting nay.
Thank you. Next up, the items on the playgrounds for Weber and Borlaug. We'll take these two together.
Right. And my concerns with this is we are still working on inclusion, and both of these plans have minimum ADA on them and not any more inclusion, and not having anything back from the DOJ on the investigations, and with nothing done here on no maintenance plan on surfaces on that, and not even knowing if the zero entries are going to be considered compliant. I move that we not approve this at this time.
Can I change that motion?
Sure.
You need to withdraw it.
So I withdraw the, yeah, excuse me.
I move that we approve the playground equipment for Weber and Borlaug Elementary.
Second.
Any further comments? So I just want to confirm we're voting on approving these two items. Yes, thank you, Kim. We're ready to vote.
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with Directors Rotland, Ressler, Godwin, Malone, and Eystone voting yea and Director Hemingway voting nay.
Thank you. Number 15.
Yes, number 15 is the work on the foundation at City High on a student-built project. We've discussed this over the past. There were some concerns with how the bidding went in the first place, and the Home Building Association, the individual selected not being a member of the Home Building Association, and some issues with that. Originally, it started off as a $78,000 contract, and the last line on that proposal says change order for reduction in cost may be forthcoming. There were multiple, I can list 17, and I won't go into that right at the moment, with issues with it. It's ending up going to cost us $82,891.64 with this change order. And if we, as individuals, would have had a contractor come with a change order with this, with some of the issues that were encountered on this project, we would not pay for it. So I urge that this not be approved.
I'm going to consider that not a motion, since you
Correct,
didn't
that's
say,
not a
okay,
motion, that is a
I move that
comment.
we approve the City High ACE Student Project Award of Contract.
Second.
Okay, I'm ready to vote.
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries, with Directors Rotland, Ressler, Godwin, Malone, and Eystone voting yea, and Director Hemingway voting nay.
Thank you. Next up, public hearing, Alexander Elementary Edition.
Now is the time and place for the public hearing on the proposed plans and specifications for the Alexander Elementary School Addition project. The Board of Directors set the date for this public hearing on May 22nd, 2018. Notice of public hearing was published in the Iowa City Press Citizen on May 23rd, 2018. The district will receive bids on this project at 2 p.m. on June 14th, 2018 at the Educational Services Center located at 1725 North Dodge Street, Iowa City, Iowa, 52245. Notice to contractors was published as required by law in multiple statewide plan rooms and on the Iowa City Community School District website on May 23rd, 2018. Are there any questions from the board? Are there any questions from the public? I declare this public hearing closed.
Thank you. Next up is the discussion item on dress code. And Matt, is that you tonight?
Yeah. Do you want me to pull up the slides? Or?
Maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do.
Where we go?
Okay, so Kingsley's team prepared this in collaboration with us here. I think from the student speakers we had and community commenters regarding this issue, it was good for us as an administrative team to kind of dig in and find out where we have some differences, and I think some of the work we need to do to address some of this. And so, as you can tell here, there's kind of three different pieces of this work. First talks about what the state and district code alignment needs to be, and then the second lens of this would be looking for potential policy language and bias that we have in our own policy or in our own handbooks, and then determining what those next steps to rectify those issues would be. So the Iowa Board of Education talks about that school boards can adopt a dress code policy that prohibits students from wearing gang-related or other specific apparel if the board determines that the policy is necessary for the health, safety, or positive educational environment of students and staff. In our own administrative code, it talks about student appearance being a material and substantial disruption to the school environment or presents a threat to health and safety of students, employees, and visitors. So our code does align with state guidelines. I mean, there is alignment there. There's no misalignment that way. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be that way, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with the way Code 539 reads in accordance with the state code. But when we start to look across the system and we look for administrative code that we work with you guys, and then our elementary and secondary handbooks, we find parts that align pretty closely to that code, and then we find some parts that differ. You can see the parts that have some alignment across there. The ones that would differ would say our administrative code talks about extreme hairstyle and dress that's unduly modest, distracting or inappropriate, and then clothes with holes or tears in appropriate places. And we would see that differ with our elementary handbook that talks about those, the backless, strapless, halter style tops or spaghetti straps, and then secondary handbook talks about excessive cleavage, inappropriate short skirts or shorts. So really some of those same issues that the student speakers were addressing with us at that time. Some of the things that are alignments talk about hats, head coverings, clothing that promotes obviously profane or obscene things that way, or sale of drugs and alcohol, those types of things. So when we look for potential bias in there, I think that's probably easy to see the way with some of that stuff is worded and some of the way that we know it gets administered, and part of, I think, what of our work to do moving forward is. But there's a couple key points here that I think is pulled out of research or pulled out of some of the things we know. But dress codes operate within a larger cultural context, one in which women, especially black women, are frequently sexualized. Concerns arise about the larger symbolic message dress code and their enforcement sends to students and society. So how it adversely affects that subgroup population. The common justification that provocative and revealing clothing will distract male classmates communicates the message that girls' bodies are inherently sexual, provocative, dangerous, and that harassment's inevitable. And then finally, gender studies scholars report that dress codes have negative ramifications for women, sending messages that expose that the female body is bad. This can negatively impact cognitive and physical function and healthy attitudes about gender roles and sexual roles. And so, I think that's where we have to look at what is being stated in the policy and the enforcement of that policy, and then what biases are going to be created from that. So there's a couple policy pieces here that are pulled out that directly address the concern. So the first one talks about girls being more physically developed or curvier may be viewed as more promiscuous by adults, leading them to be punished more often for tight or low-fitting clothing. So then how are they being approached inappropriately or more often than maybe some other students? And then the same thing here with hairstyles or dress that's interpreted as unduly modest, distracting, or inappropriate. And this could be disproportionately affecting black hairstyles and head coverings, which often have specific cultural or religious meaning and viewed as unprofessional. I will say I think we've made quite a bit of movement just informally in with the head coverings issue. You even see our high schools allowing hats to that regard. Obviously, this is speaking about religious head coverings or cultural head coverings, but I know we've really kind of backed off of what we're enforcing or choosing to ask students to remove in that regard. So I think next steps for us as we look at this is to ensure, first of all, that we have alignment with that administrative dress code. So that first slide where there showed some differences, we need to clean that up and make sure that there's straight alignment that way. And then we need to consider different ways to approach students who violate the dress code. I oftentimes think from my experience as a building principal, when we get into issues over dress code, it was really less about the actual conversation about the article of clothing and more about how the situation was dealt with, or how that situation was approached and handled with the staff member and with the student. We do need to consider, I think, current changes to policy to make sure we address any biased language or the biased language we know is present. And then we could talk to you guys about how you'd like to see that come forward. And then empower and include student voices. I think this was the biggest benefit I saw from working through some of these issues, was being able to bring students into the fold, give them a voice in that, make sure they were part of kind of determining what that culture looked like around student dress, and making sure that they felt like they had input into that conversation, and that it was clearly and consistently communicated throughout the school building that way. So that's a few things to kind of run through with you there in regards to kind of what we found out, or some of the work we've done so far, but definitely would like to hear from you if you think there's other next steps we're missing, or how you'd like to see this come back to you as we continue this work.
I just have a question. So with the next steps, in particular, number 1 and 2, is this work occurring over the summer? So then that way, when teachers and students come back next year, the handbooks have been aligned to our dress codes? and everybody's aware of that change? And in regards to number two, is there any hands-on discussion or training taking place with our teachers and staff to walk them through examples of how not to shame our students?
Yeah, I think that's some of the work we still need to do, Ruthina. And, you know, we covered this with the administrative team at the last admin council meeting of the school year. We'd kind of just had the community commenter. We'd been doing this background work and then talked to them about the fact that we would be bringing this presentation forward and some of that next step work that would need to happen. So I definitely think this is work we'll be engaged in throughout the summer and at the start of the school year. If nothing else, we need that handbook alignment to take place, and then we need to look at the training component as we bring staff back on board in the fall.
Well, I want to thank the students for bringing it to our attention and their presentation before us. And I know I attended a DPO meeting where the superintendent from Davenport spoke. And he talked about the next big step he wanted to do in Davenport, and one of them was uniforms. And I know with our people talking to them out about safety and security and how it came into the different discussions that we had during community comment, I think that a discussion on possible implementation of a uniform, I've seen it in different communities and in different parts of the world, and talking with some staff there, I've gotten some interest from them on it, and I think it's a discussion that would be beneficial for us to have and see if that's something that might help us in the work world. People wear a uniform, and it's you act a little differently when you're wearing it, and you're in that responsibility and that. So I think that that's something that we might want to include in our safety and security discussion, as it might fit into that discussion.
Other comments?
I'm going to disagree with Phil on that. I think that blurs the line between equal and equitable, and I'm not a fan of uniforms, but I think the step on looking at the biased language, I think, is kind of at the core of why we had students talking about it in the first place, is that it does specifically target girls, and any language in there that's picking out specific children as opposed to being a general statement is problematic. And so I think that is probably the key next step, is looking at some of that biased language in there and make sure that it's doing what we want it to do, and it's not creating more of an issue that is not even there in the first place.
Who all will you be having involved in the alignment? I mean, one of my questions is maybe we involve students in reviewing what the new guidelines look like.
Sorry, I think I missed part of what you said there, but can you repeat it?
Yeah, who all is going to be part of the process for revising the guidelines, and maybe we include students in the review of it, just to keep that inclusion going forward?
Right, I think administratively we need to review those and get them in alignment, and then I think part of that process is, once we feel like there's alignment, is then getting feedback from different stakeholder groups, and definitely see students as being a critical part of that, and trying to engage them in what that looks like, and their response to that, and then if we need to adjust from there.
Any other comments or questions? I also want to thank the students for bringing this to our attention and doing so eloquently, and you've made action happen, so right on. Anything else? Okay, thank you, Matt, for that. I appreciate it. Next up, we are going to move to the presentation portion of the agenda, and we'll start with the policy review, employee hiring practices, and volunteer background screening. I think Jane and Joe are going to talk about this. I just have a couple remarks before we get into it. I think this is really an overview of current practices and our compliance with policy and code. I think there's some things that might come out of the conversation that might foster some ideas for change, but that I don't know that tonight's the night to really get into that. I think I'd like to poll the group at the end of the discussion. Maybe we need a work session at some point to get into this in more detail, and so I don't want to ideate a lot. I want to take the time to listen tonight and then decide if we need to have a deeper discussion at a work session later. I also want to make sure that tonight we don't get into references around specific personnel matters. This is really just a review of our current practices and compliance. So with that, I'll turn it over to, who's starting? Jane? Joe.
Good evening. It's not a real tightly organized presentation, but I think a starting point is what's legally required. There are a number of requirements in the Iowa Code which all deal with employees and what kind of screening employees go through before they're added to staff. And this covers employees across the board, everywhere from a cook or custodian to a teacher to the superintendent. There are a little bit different requirements for licensed employees, which are principally teachers and administrators. State law requires that all school employees have a background check. Anybody who's going to work in the school district has a background check. There are really 5 components to that. There's the state sex offender registry, there's the state child abuse registry, there's the state dependent adult abuse registry, there's a state criminal background check and a national criminal background check. And one thing that's happened in recent times, in 2013, the legislature changed the law to require periodic updates of those background checks. Previously, once a person's hired, they have the background check, it's basically done. You don't repeat it unless there's some reason to. Now, every 5 years, employees are subject to those background checks, and that covers everybody in that entire pyramid in the school district of employees. That's something that I think you need to think a little bit about from a budgetary standpoint. You have, give or take, 3,000 people that are covered by that requirement, and a lot of them have been here longer than 5 years. In the last 5 years, people have probably had background checks as they came on board. And I don't know what the breakdown of that number is, but those background checks cost about $45 a piece. So you multiply that number out, you're talking a fairly sizable number to do those background checks. And the way I read the law, anybody who's been here and hasn't had a background check in the last 5 years, this is the year you're going to have to do it, starting July 1 of 2018. New teachers are subject to a requirement that the Board of Educational Examiners makes all those checks. So those people come to you pre-screened by the Board of Educational Examiners when they get their initial teaching license. Now the district goes beyond that and basically, in some instances, redoes that check. So that's what's legally required, and I don't know that there's a whole lot you can do in terms of a background check beyond that, in terms of checking references or looking for other sources of information. Those 5 components are the basic sources of information out there. And so far as I've been able to determine, based upon the background checks I've seen, the district is complying with that, and all those background checks are in employee files. Volunteers are a different situation because I can't find anything in state law that requires a background check for volunteers. And because of some other circumstances, I actually made some inquiries to members of the Iowa Council of School Board Attorneys. And I was really surprised that one response I got was this district is not doing background checks on volunteers. And their school attorney said, well, I suppose we ought to be doing those because you spend time with kids. And I couldn't really believe what century this individual in the school district's living in. Iowa City does a background check on all volunteers. Most districts I'm acquainted with do that, including board members, if board members are going to volunteer in school buildings. So it's really a top-to-bottom process, and nobody's exempt, and the board leads by example. Right now, what Iowa City is doing is a lesser background check than employees. Those 3 registries I talked about, the one that isn't in there is a national criminal background check. And I think one of the topics for discussion in whether any changes are necessary or desirable is whether to include that. Now that ups the cost because the child abuse registry, dependent adult registry, sex offender registry, and a state criminal background check costs $12 for volunteers. And right now the district is paying that fee for volunteers because volunteers bring a lot of value to the district. If you add that 5th component in the national criminal background check, you up the cost to $45. So either the district is going to absorb that, and you have literally thousands of volunteers out there, or you're going to pass that on to those individuals, and that may discourage some individuals, particularly people who don't have the means from paying the $45 for a background check. I think you also need to consider the how frequently those background checks get repeated. As I said, with employees, it's every 5 years. I don't know, volunteers come and go at a differential rate. I don't know if you want to consider how often you do that. Just bear in mind the cost of that and what it involves. So that's sort of the landscape as far as what state law requires and what's the district currently doing. So I think, and Jane's going to probably amplify some of those things a little bit, but there are related issues out there that might be topics for either policy and governance or the school safety committee in terms of dealing with desirable components of where you go from here. I think it's important to consider not discouraging people from volunteering and not making it economically problematic for the district or them, balancing that against ensuring a safe environment for children in the school district. Do any of you have any questions so far?
Well, you elaborated on a lot of groups. We have so much construction going on in our schools and have school and going on at schools. What are the requirements for contractors or vendors that do work in our schools? Are they subject to background checks as well? Is that part of an employment contract?
So far as I know, that's not required under state law. I've been involved in some construction contracts which had provisions for background checks, particularly the sex offender registry. And I think you can build that into your construction contracts, that the contractors have to provide that. And I've also seen contracts which make it clear that people working on those construction projects can't smoke on school property because that's actually prohibited by state law. So I think that something has to be done at a district level. There's no state law which says you have to have those kind of background checks. A private contractor contracts with the district has to have those.
So we don't have anything in the works right at the moment?
Not that I'm aware of. Now,
Craig wants
people
to
in the
make
physical plant or Jane may be able to amplify that as far as what's built into the contracts. Often those are drafted by architect, engineer, and I'm not sure they always think about that, so it may be something to have that conversation with your consultants and also maybe build something into sort of a general policy on what you want to see. It may also depend on where they're working in the district, if they're in an area where there are students present versus an area where there aren't students present. For example, when you're building Liberty High, there are no students present while the building's being constructed. Now, if you go into a remodeling project like Alexander, depending on the time of year, there will be students there. So I think it's sort of...
I was thinking specifically West High, where there was a lot of construction going on while the school was in session.
That's a very good question.
Yeah, we currently do that with our construction contracts. We require the contractors to provide background checks on their employees who are working on site. And we also, any vendor that we use in our facilities management and nutrition services department, if they come on site to repair or to make to do anything in our buildings, we run them through the Raptor system. We do a background check and give them a temporary ID to be on property. So we're actively involved in managing that piece.
Any other questions from me? If not, I'll let Jane talk a little bit about the internal practices.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
I think we would do want to, I think, maybe conclude by some questions about where things might go from here and what areas of inquiry the board might want to get into to come to a work session or take to one of those committees who might be looking further at the issues.
Thanks, Joe. As he mentioned too, this is going to be a little redundant because obviously we want to comply with the law, and in some areas we go a little bit above and beyond that, but this will sound very similar to the pieces that Joe had highlighted. So our current practice is that all volunteers are substitutes across any of the categories, whether it's substitute teacher, substitute para, substitute secretary, and then any potential staff members must complete the application process, which in our district includes a background check. And we look for those applications to be completed because we also want to make sure that we're able to reach out and touch base with references within those job applications as well. The background screening for us is completed by third-degree screening, which is out of Council Bluffs, and that is done for all applicants who are recommended for hire. So when the district hires a teacher with an initial or an exchange license, as Joe had mentioned, the background check is completed by third degree. And in addition, the BOEE automatically conducts their own background check, which at that time includes the FBI fingerprint check. So we do that extra step by also including a screening with third degree. And then employees, just the regular employees that are recommended for hire that already have a 279.13 contract, which would mean our certified or licensed staff. We also go through a complete background check with third degree, and they are also have to submit to an FBI fingerprint background check as well. Our screening does go through third degree, and it's provided at the two different levels that Joe had mentioned. We have what we call the volunteer basic package, which is our less expensive, the $12 package, which includes the county criminal research record search, the sex offender record search, and an Iowa child and dependent adult abuse registry information search. When it comes into the standard extended package, which we do for all other employee groups, which would be everyone, physical plant, nutrition services, teaching staff, paras, secretaries, all of those folks. This includes those other three searches, as well as a federal criminal records background search, and then the National Criminal Database alias search, and the government watch list. So those are above and beyond those other three basic searches on those registries. The law requires when you use an external agency to run your background checks that the applicant completes the electronic authorization then for that check, and that includes the authorization for the two Iowa registries, which is the Dependent Adult Abuse and Child Abuse Registries. And one of the reasons that we use third degree is because they are the only vendor in Iowa that they approve to process the Iowa registry checks. So that, you know, I know there's been some discussion about why we use that particular agency, and that is one of the reasons. The state law mandates that the district rechecks backgrounds, again, as Joe had said, every 5 years. Certified staff will go through a BOEE recheck at that time, but again, the district also redoes their check as well. The volunteers, at this time, we do not have a schedule or cycle to redo background checks on our volunteers. And so that would be one of the areas through a work session or through P&G that we want to have a conversation about how would we do that. At this time, we have a vast number of volunteers who may have volunteered one time years ago when their child was in one of our elementary buildings and have not volunteered since. Some people may have never volunteered. Some whose children are no longer in the district, and some who volunteer very, very regularly, and they have children regularly coming through our system. So we'd like to go through and clean that out and decide how do we determine and go back on how many background checks do we need to upgrade and redo and renew. And as Joe said, then the cost of all of those background checks are borne by us. The district pays for all of those because we do not want that to be an interfering factor with people being able to either apply and secure work with us or to be able to volunteer within the district.
Questions for Jane?
When you do a check and something comes up, what would be at the level of something that would not would essentially be a deal breaker for someone for employment? Is that an OWI? What?
Well, a deal breaker, obviously, if they appear on any of those Iowa registries, that's okay. Pretty much an automatic. What we look at, the EEOC requires that you provide a review in 3 different areas, and you look at the nature of the crime itself. You'll look at the time that's elapsed since that crime was done. Look at the nature of that crime specific to the job that this person is applying for. I know you talked construction earlier. One of the areas that we talk about, if we have someone who maybe has a theft fifth in their background, that would be a person, and maybe that was 5 years ago. Maybe as we look at employment opportunities for that individual, is this a job where this person will have access to funds within the school, money within the school? Is that an interfering factor? And would that alone be a reason that we would refuse to employ that individual person? So in order to make sure that we apply those conditions consistently across all groups, EEOC requires that we review that in a consistent way. Also, with some of those folks, if they, when we'll have them come in and talk through what was your situation at that time. You know, you might have people with either an OWI or a charge that was when they were 19 or 20 years old. They were in college. It's been 5 or 10 years. All of those things will impact that decision. A hit on their background check does not automatically keep them from being eligible for employment.
Other comments or questions? Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
I just want to make a couple of comments sort of in the going forward mode, and some of those questions are what Jane just addressed. What happens when things turn up on those records? If it's the 3 registries, there's an automatic termination. The employee's entitled to a hearing before the board, but the only issue is, are they wrongfully on that registry? If they're on the registry, they're gone. So that's a disqualification under state law. It gets more problematic when you have things like an OWI. Every school district I've represented, I've had employees who were arrested for OWI or other offenses, and one school of thought is if they've been arrested for anything, they're done. But there are some criteria. I think it may be, and Jane's right, EEOC has some guidance on what you have to look at that may or may not need to be formalized internally. I don't know that necessarily it needs to be part of board policy, but in the HR department there may need to be something. And one thing we've had some discussion about is in looking at arrests and convictions, especially when you're dealing with volunteers, is that can have a disparate impact on people because certain ethnic groups are arrested and even convicted at higher rates. And I'm not saying you look at the person's ethnicity in making that decision, but I think somehow that's factored in a way that it's across the board fair to everybody because you don't want to have that disparate impact. And that's, I think in going forward, that's a discussion that needs to happen internally about those questions. You may be aware that some counties, and Lynn County just recently did away with what they call check the box. They don't even ask if a person's been arrested or if they've been convicted. They still do the background checks. I mean, I think you still need to do that, but you don't want that chilling effect on people, and you don't want to discourage people, particularly I would say more volunteers. You want valuable volunteers, and people being who they are, they sometimes come with checkered backgrounds. That doesn't mean they're bad people. They just were stupid at a point in their life. And you need a mechanism to screen that out and give them the opportunity to show you who they really are. So I think that's one of the things we've talked a little bit about, and a third degree has provided some information about the kind of questions you ask and how you let people explain what happened and go through that process Jane talked about to make individualized decisions about those people. So I hope that if the board has questions or things you want to particularly address, I think you need to make sure that whether it's there's kind of an overlap between school safety and policy and governance. Probably more likely policy and governance, but obviously the people you have in the building can be a safety issue. Mm-hmm. So I think you can't put this in a neat and tidy silo. You need to look at a little bigger picture.
Joe, do you feel like our policies cover us well enough, or do we need to do a policy review on this and get that tightened up?
I think right now what's in place is adequate. I think there's room for improvement. And sort of regularizing that process. And a big challenge is that what you're looking at is past behavior. You can't always predict future behavior based on past behavior. And one of the things I hope will be helpful, particularly in dealing with volunteers, is I think some of the board members know I also represent Mid-Prairie Community School District, which has had a big controversy about a volunteer who had been on but was no longer on the sex offender registry, and how do you deal with that? That's brought up the bigger context of how do you deal with all these other sort of knotty little issues when you're screening people, whether it's for employment or whether it's for volunteer work. And they have a committee which is looking at that, and hopefully they're going to be producing some policies and some suggestions later in the summer. Their goal is to have those in place by the start of the school year. And hopefully school districts, including Iowa City, can piggyback on their work and have some guidance to what makes sense. There's 35 people on the committee, which is large, but one of the components of that is they can break it down into certain parts and assign that to a subgroup. But the idea was to get widespread representation. There are, I think, 4 people from law enforcement, including the Washington County Sheriff. There are clergy from various faiths. There are teachers, there are administrators, there's parents, community members, volunteers. So they really have a broad base, which I think makes a lot of sense. It's a lot of effort for particularly a district that size. I don't know how many volunteers Iowa City has. Mid-Prairie has about 1,500 students, and they have over 800 volunteers. And so, I mean, you want that kind of engagement, but you want to look at those people and make sure you're making good decisions. So I'm hopeful I will be able to bring some information. And the Iowa Council of School Board Attorneys meeting is July 13th, I believe, and I'm actually going to be there with the Mid-Prairie superintendent to talk about this in front of the Council of School Board Attorneys and hopefully get some input from those people too about what they're doing, what they think is smart, what they think is legal, and bring some of that guidance back.
That would be great. And I just wanted to add that the reason I ask that is because if something's standardized in policy, then you take that bias piece out. Then we don't have to worry about whether we're choosing, I don't know. Implicit bias hopefully would not interfere then if it were more standard. So I'll be interested to hear what they come up with.
Thank you. I think I would be very interested in hearing that too. I think the more, whether it's formal board policy or guidelines that HR is using through these hiring screening practices, I think the more guidelines and criteria that we can outline and follow reliably would be good. I'm not sure anything that we would put in writing is going to cover every situation that's going to come up, so there's probably going to need to be some judgment applied along the way, but these guidelines and criteria or policy will help us make those same decisions over and over and eliminate bias and that kind of thing. So really look forward to what comes from Mid-Prairie, and then maybe then as a board, whether it's through P&G or the safety committee, we take that on and decide what we might want to do for our district. I think it's timely. I think we probably should put some energy and focus into it so that we feel comfortable with our practices going forward.
Yeah, I say to people, human beings are wild cards. I deal with engineers and architects and surveyors, and their rules operate with mathematical precision. And I've seen them stumped when somebody asks them a question because people will do the most off-the-wall things. They'll ask the most off-the-wall questions. So you need good policies, but you need to have some flexibility built in to deal with that wild card factor. You may have somebody who's just a dynamite person. They did something stupid when they were 20 years old, and you want to take advantage of those skills and have the flexibility to say, well, that was really stupid, but we see what you've done since. So, and I don't know that functions well at a board policy level, but I think there need to be written internal guidelines to implement that policy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joe. Jane, appreciate it very much. We'll move on to the next topic, which is kind of doing presentations backwards, the school safety update. I think, Kate, are you taking that tonight?
Yes, I will go ahead and update you on the formation of the school safety. Sorry, my voice is, I haven't talked in a couple hours. Just a second. Okay, so I'm going to update you a little bit on the formation of the School Safety Advisory Committee and the process that we're following. The whole goal of the committee is to provide guidance to the school board on school safety issues for students and staff, and then let you make decisions on what you think are also in the best interest of the students and staff in the district. Currently, we're in the process of recruiting committee members, and so June 1st, we sent out the application process and procedures through different modes of social media, the website, we had a press release, and actually it was a very effective process. We have, as of last week, we had over 70 applications filled out, and I'm sure we have even more as of today. So there's quite a bit of interest in the committee. And we'll be moving into the selection process next week. So the process that we're utilizing for selection is the development of a steering committee. And this is the process that was utilized by the Equity Department in developing several committees in the past. And what they did was they developed a steering committee of representatives that actually reviewed the applications and then selected members of the committee. So we have a steering committee composed of juvenile court representative, a disproportionate minority contact committee representative, the district equity director, an assistant superintendent, and then also a member of law enforcement. And their plan is to review the applications and follow selection criteria to determine committee membership. We're looking at that taking place Tuesday of next week, and then letting everybody know who has been selected for that committee by the 20th of June. And I can answer any questions that you have, or if you want to give us some guidance on that as well. Be happy to entertain that.
And then do you plan to meet monthly?
Right now, the plan is to meet monthly, and we asked that folks be available after 5 o'clock once a month. But I think it's really going to depend on what the goals of the committee are. And right now, there's quite a bit of latitude for what topics are discussed. The one thing that we wanted to do is look at recommendations for the fall of 2018. So if we have a committee that's really interested in looking at possibilities for the fall, I know some areas of interest are whether or not we have ALICE training for students and all staff ready to roll out in the fall. If there's recommendations like that, I can see the committee wanting to meet a little bit more here in the summer so we're ready to go in the fall. And then we want to have a long-term plan ready by the spring of 2019 for the school board.
Any other questions for Kate? Thank you for providing the overview of the process, and I'm glad to hear so many people have expressed interest in being on that committee. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. It's exciting.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Up next, we've got the Equity Committee.
Hello again, and once again, thank you for having us. Tonight, we are here to present our 5th update, and this time we'll be focusing on English language learners, which we will abbreviate in the slides as ELLs. We are pleased to be on the agenda each month, reporting on the Comprehensive Equity Plan. As a recap, our first update, we introduced the idea of having a schedule and monitoring the Comprehensive Equity Plan and attending to it monthly. Our second update focused on diverse hiring, and we brought in an expert who had done some research in the district. We made a recommendation at the time that we felt the Comprehensive Equity Plan should be updated. Our fourth update in April, when the board put the discussions item on the agenda during the first meeting of the month, we focused on achievement, and once again, we called for an update of the Comprehensive Equity Plan. Our most recent update in May was on discipline. At that time, we revised our recommendation to call for a task force comprised of subgroups to update the Comprehensive Equity Plan. We made this revision because we recognized that the complexity of the issues before the district, noting that the time our small group was spending to study each topic needed to be done in support of the administrators and others in the district and the community. As we prepare for this update, we want to reiterate our view that the equity plan needs to be updated. As we have said, we strongly believe that the staff involved in leading the components of the equity plan must be at the table when the plans are developed. This is not the work of the equity committee alone. That said, we have seen progress. We see that the district is acknowledging the inequities and expressing a desire to meet the needs of all of our learners. As we move through the process of change, the next step would be a gathering of all the stakeholders across the system to turn the desire for change into concrete, achievable steps. The Equity Committee can support this process, and the process must be led by the district. Again, we will be updating you on our exploration into the strengths and challenges faced by our English language learners in the district. During our studies, our committee was educated by Dr. Chris Stevens, who researched the district's ELL program and as part of her PhD dissertation. She has moved on to a position in DC but remains in contact with the EAC. We are emailing a copy of her presentation, and we will invite the administration to post it on board docs. We studied the experiences of ELLs, and we found one of our main findings is that most of us in the committee have a lot to learn about ELLs. We are looking forward to learning more from the administration and from others at the university and in our community. Also, while we found that all the issues in the Comprehensive Equity Plan require deeper work, we found that though we all intended to, the Comprehensive Equity Plan does not actually formally address ELLs. Our ELLs and their families and advocates have shared that they often feel invisible. And we realized that even in our own deliberations, until we made a conscious effort to focus on them, we too were overlooking their strengths and their needs. So with that, I will give you the 3 key points that we think that we would like you to think about on how to improve the ELLs in our district. First, we think it's important to note just how large this subgroup of students we are talking about. Second, we want to share some insights gained as we used an equity lens to look at the experiences and outcomes of our ELLs. Third, it is especially important to think about the importance of family engagement and the particular strengths brought and the barriers faced by the families of our English learners.
The number of students in the district's English language learner program exceeds that of other programs, such as those programs supporting learners in special education, programs for homeless students, advanced placement programs, and individual co-curricular and extracurricular programs, just to name a few. With the growth in our district, the number of students enrolled in our ELL programs has grown dramatically in the past 10 years. And looking at English language learners through an equity lens, we would expect these students to comprise about 11.5% of each and every program in the district. You may be asking, what does our ELL program do for the students? What supports does it provide, and how are students learning? Some of the answers we found are as follows. English language learners in the district receive about 27 to 45 minutes of pull-out ELL language instruction per day. 27 to 45 minutes per day. With others at junior high and high school receiving a content area class, such as basic science or social studies, that's taught through sheltered instruction, a technique where language and content are taught simultaneously. We found there were no substitutes hired for ELL teachers, so when the ELL teacher is absent, the student's support for learning does not occur. This 27 to 45 minutes of pull-out instruction means that ELL students are learning language and literacy from their general education classroom teachers for at least 87% of their school day. The district has been investing in more sheltered instruction training for mainstream teachers through the SIOP model, SIOP. We learned that research suggests that there are some pitfalls in implementing this model when teachers have not had extensive training in ELL instruction. Research into the sheltered instruction model by Dr. Chris Stevens and Johnson in 2014, she was the member of our Equity Advisory Committee until May and an ELL researcher in our district, indicates that general education teachers do not know that with the sheltered instruction model, they are the main source of instruction for ELL students. And most think it is in the ELL pullout where they believe that the primary instruction for students occurs. The Equity Committee is unaware of the number of general education classroom teachers trained in the SIOP model. the trajectory for full training of all district teachers, and we are unaware of who is monitoring this timeline. These would be questions for the administration. The district must be clear on the role this training plays in the overall instruction of ELLs and communicate the roles and responsibilities clearly to teachers and to administrators. General education teachers need to be aware that they are the main language instructors for ELL students. General education teachers should be trained and regularly collaborate with ELL teachers, and these ELL teachers typically have extensive knowledge about how to support language and content. Typically, teachers who do not have extensive ELL training cannot be expected to implement PSYOP strategies with high fidelity to the model without extensive support. This training for general education teachers is important. The district might further consider developing the co-teaching option that's listed in our district's LAU plan between ELL experts and mainstream teachers. ELLs are the most highly tested group of students we have, yet we are not clear as a committee how testing data is used to drive decision-making. Along with the assessments required of all students, ELL students also take placement tests and tests of English language development in accordance with state policy. What is clear to us and to the researchers is that every test is a language test. Language and content for ELLs cannot be separated. Most standardized tests are not normed for ELL students. This means that the ELL test scores alone are not valid indicators of whether or not a student qualifies for special education, ELP, or AP classes. Currently, there is an over and under representation of ELLs in these areas, and school staff report a lack of clarity on how to identify ELLs accurately for these services. This needs to be addressed through a clear district-wide policy that is equitable for English language learners. And it is also important to note that once English language learners test out of ELL status, they are often still developing language skills. So the figure of 1,600 students in the ELL program would actually be much larger when we think of the students who are still developing their language proficiency and have tested out. The Every Student Succeeds Act plan for Iowa allows for following ELL students for 4 years after they exit the ELL program. It would be important to know how long the district follows and how the district supports students after they exit the ELL program. We have been operating as a committee under the belief that English language learners were fully incorporated in our comprehensive equity plan. As we went about our study of the implementation of the plan, however, we discovered that somewhere along the way we lost them. English language learners are a subgroup under the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind. However, they are not included as one of the district's protected classes. It turns out that we used protected classes, in quotes, as the shorthand in the plan, which means English language learners are not explicitly addressed, and we feel this needs to be fixed. Initiatives associated with the Comprehensive Equity Plan, such as parent involvement, diverse hiring, and languages represented in the school buildings should be explicitly including language learners to facilitate student and family access to education. School climate is in need of improvement, and many ELL parents face barriers to access. Many ELL parents face barriers to access related to social economic status, cultural background, migratory status, and cultural climate in the schools. Students feel left out and left behind when pursuing their hopes and dreams. Immigrant bullying is a major societal problem that is reflected in our schools here and often goes unaddressed due to fear. To address all of this, we are not talking about just implementing another intervention. This really is about a paradigm shift. How does the entire system take responsibility for and support English language learners? Looking at English language learners through an equity lens calls for everyone to be involved as we move through the stages of change. We believe the district is ready to move from contemplation into preparation stage of change. This means that as a whole, we have identified a problem. It is now time to explore potential paths towards that action. The Equity Committee can support this process, a process led by the district.
Parents of English language learners have varying degrees of formal education, whether they come to us from a culture where women exit the formal system of education at a 4th grade level, or they have a PhD. All parents deserve to be engaged as full partners in their children's education. Research in our district demonstrates that parents of English learners value education deeply, yet they face multiple barriers to engagement. Beyond our limited cultural competency, another obvious barrier is language. For example, Dr. Stevens' study found that though the district provides interpreters, they are often not highly trained, which means that the interpretations can be highly inaccurate or misleading for the school staff and parents. Likewise, the teachers are not highly trained to work with the interpreters, which means that this can make communication difficult for interpreters and parents. Many school staff don't know that they can request interpreters for homeschool communication, and some may be discouraged due to the cost. Others are not aware that if they only send communications out over email, this means that many of the ELL parents will not have access to the information that is being shared. Many of the ELL families would be better served by receiving text communications, as access to email is not always readily available, preferably text in their language. Installing a signage and multiple languages throughout the schools can also help parents. These are some of the recommendations. Dr. Stevens' study has several other recommendations for how to improve the experiences of families in our district, which we believe should be considered. As a recap, because of the large number of ELL students, ELL success in the district is the district's success. Passing over ELL issues can lead to lower scores across the board. Most ELL learning occurs in regular classrooms. While our ELL teachers provide very important services, the vast majority of the time that English language learners spend in our classroom is spent with our general education teachers. Everyone deserves support in understanding how to best serve the students. Our district has the tools necessary to overcome some of the challenges that our families are faced with. As our recommendations, as a first step, we feel the district must formally incorporate ELLs into the comprehensive equity plan. You will want to ask for disaggregated data by ELL students for all the district's programs, and to determine how well the new approaches that are being implemented are working. To that end, you will want to continue to study and monitor the implementation and effectiveness of the LAU plan. We have a lot of experts in our schools and our community that we can draw on as we determine the best ways to support ELLs, their families, teachers, and the system as a whole. As we continue to look into how to improve the experiences and outcomes of ELLs, we should look into developing a broader language policy for the district. We should increase training for all teachers. Again, all teachers are a vital segment of our educator staff, who themselves play multiple roles and deserve recognition, engagement, and support. but ELLs spend their vast majority of their time in regular classrooms, so our general ed teachers also need ongoing training and support. We are pleased to see the district acknowledging inequities and expressing a desire to meet the needs of all of our learners. We are on a journey together, and we all need to keep moving forward. This is the time to move from contemplation to planning. The next step would be gathering of stakeholders across the system to turn the desire for change into concrete, achievable steps. The Equity Committee can support this process, and the process must be led by the district. We are happy to continue updating the board on our explorations. We hope that more of our time is spent supporting advancement along the continuum of change than simply sharing our lessons learned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Yes.
I have a couple maybe comments and questions maybe to Matt. So what I wrote about this in my op-ed piece in the paper, but when I went to Southeast, they had just started the sheltered science class. And do they also have language arts class there as well?
Yes, I believe so. Part of our work, I think, at the secondary level is looking at what sheltered classes we offer and trying to bring some alignment to those as they've grown and as we've increased training opportunities for teachers. We've had some maybe disalignment created with that about some courses being offered at some schools and others not, just based on skill set of teachers and, like I said, training opportunities. So that's part of our work. We know at the EL moving forward, but we do have several sheltered offerings at the secondary buildings.
And so I guess one of the questions with that, I thought the class was great, the one that I was in. The students were very engaged, and having both teachers there to help was great. And one of the concerns that the staff brought up, and maybe you can address it, is they felt like if they continued to do the sheltered classes with those group of students who were always together more than they were in a general ed class. Is that something that you guys are watching for, I guess, as you continue to...
That the students don't travel all day.
Right,
with the
so
same group of students.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That's something we try to account for with that, that they, are with other peers in the school and have those opportunities as well. So it's a careful balance of trying to provide that language instruction. That's why the SIOP model is so valuable as far as the professional development piece for teachers, because we know that teaching that language explicitly helps all kids and helps lesson design for all students, whether or not language is necessarily whether or not English is being learned as another language for them. So that's why we're really trying to reach that SIOP training to as many staff as possible.
And then just one more comment for maybe the board and the equity committee is on our legislative priorities that we approved before this group was elected. The fourth one was support for English language learner students. And just what we had written down was extend weighted English language learner funding from 5 years to 7 years per pupil. In accordance with evidence-based practice, the ICCSD has seen a 300% increase in ELL students over the past 4 years and is now home to nearly 1,400 ELL students, and now we know that's 1,600 in just that 1 year. So the increase is even bigger, but that first push to 5 years from 4 years, I believe it was, right, that was the number one priority for the Des Moines Public Schools a couple of years ago. And they got, that was approved by Branstad, and this second push to go from 5 years to 7 years for those students that really need that help hasn't really gained any traction yet. So I just want to let you guys know that it is on the radar, at least of our legislative priorities that didn't necessarily go as we had wanted last year, but it's on there.
That's good. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about number 3, look into developing a broader language policy for the district. Could you tell me more about what you mean by that?
I'm not the expert in this subject, Dr. Krisa is, but she spoke about how language is not addressed in our comprehensive equity plan, or the difference in languages in our district per se. It's peripherally talked about because it encompasses other parts of the comprehensive equity plan, but there's nothing specifically addressing the need for multiple languages or how to deal with multiple languages in our district.
So if we incorporated that into the equity plan, would that accomplish what you're looking for there?
I think that she felt it was a big step forward, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then I just have another quick question for Amy and Matt. Do we have pretty good retention and stability with our ELL staff. Okay. I mean,
Probably don't have a good feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, we hire a lot of them. Yeah, as fast as we can. Yeah.
Remind you or share that we were lucky enough to be part of Grandview University's Project Empower Grant, which they were awarded, and I believe there's 6 or 7 districts in the state that got to be part of this grant, where they are certifying 155 teachers statewide in those 6 or 7 districts to be ELL endorsed, and as part of that, Iowa City was a recipient of 25 of those spots. So over the next 4 years, we'll have 7, 6, 6, 6, if I'm doing my addition right there, of our teachers trained. And so we went through an application process. At the elementary level, we were looking at classroom teachers. We want these teachers to stay in the classroom as much as possible, although we do know that we have a hiring shortage when it comes to ELL teachers. And so some of these people might end up teaching ELL classes for us. And at the secondary level, we asked for content area teachers, so science, social studies, math, or English language arts teachers. So we're excited. We'll have 7 teachers embarking on a year-long program with Grandview, and then identify 6 more the following year. So we're
Great.
excited about being able to bring more teachers into having that background.
I was at a conference last weekend regarding culturally responsive healthcare, since I work in healthcare. And one of the things that was mentioned about, or mentioned is in working with other populations where there's other languages spoken, it's extremely important to have consistency of staff. That's important to build relationships with the families and the students. So I was just wondering how we're doing on that.
I don't know that I feel like we have a lot of turnover there. I feel like we're continuing to add FTE, and that's our struggle, is to get people mid-year or at any time of the year.
And we have had a couple of teachers who have been foreign language teachers in the district that when ELL openings occurred either within their buildings or at same grade level buildings have transitioned into those roles and opted back into those instead. So that's creates a little shortage on the other end, but it's been exciting that that's an area that they're really motivated to move into too.
Thank you.
And just one more follow-up. Next year, will it be the first year, or are we still missing one school to have ELL programming ever? For next year, is the first year. And so I think that's going to help, just because as I remember having conversations with Steve about this, that students or families would often opt out of those services if they had to leave their home school. So now that we have them in every school, I think that's going to be very helpful.
And to remind the board, our local taxpayers support the ELL program with $1.2 million in additional property taxes over and above the state-funded portion that we allocate towards the program. So,
Fantastic. Thank you, Yolanda,
Thank you.
Stephanie, and the entire Equity Committee. Really, really thorough, nice work. Thank you so much. Moving on to our action items for the night. The first up is board goals. We decided to bring this forward to vote on. We did have a community member send us a note today exhorting us not to approve these goals because they weren't measurable and aligned fully, and I actually completely agree with the comments that came forward in that email. However, I think it's an ongoing process to distill and refine goals. I think we made progress in the work that we did in the retreat. I think these reflect the direction that we wanted to articulate for the district. I think it's important as we move into the process for setting superintendent goals for the 18-19 year that we have something that we've crafted for ourselves, so then we can start that articulation to superintendent goals. So I think through that process of ours guiding the superintendents, we may choose to make some modifications. There may be some things on ours that are really more specific to superintendent goal, for example, and I think through that process we can identify some of those things and make changes. But again, I think that we had a healthy conversation around the areas of focus and the goals that we wanted to work on and some of the supporting activities. And I'd open it up to any of the comments from board members about the goals that we have in front of us tonight.
And I guess I'd say that I felt like all of us had our voices heard on specific things we wanted to see as goals, and we were able to kind of get them in there and wordsmith them a little bit, and I don't think we even have to vote on it. I think the point was that we were going to bring it forward to show that we have this kind of affirmation that we want to focus on these things, but they're, again, not at the exclusion of everything else. So I think it's reflective of, everyone sitting up here and the one missing person that we all had some input into it, and I think we got a pretty well-rounded set of goals. So on that, I'd move that we adopt our board goals.
I second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Next up is board norms. I'd like to make a couple comments about the norms as well. We're voting on the norms tonight because we've had a recent violation of them. In our retreat on June 2nd, we addressed our norms and reconfirmed them, and we made some changes. We included the new number 1 norm, which is around student achievement, is our number 1 priority. This is to reinforce that every action we take must be in support of that greater good. We also added number 9, which is to understand and follow Iowa Code, board policies, and board norms. We felt the need, based on recent events, to add this explicit norm to reinforce our expectation of our conduct. I think some statements that I heard in that retreat are that, our efficacy as a board working on behalf of students, staff, and taxpayers is dependent on all of us living up to the norms, following the same rules, having trust in each other, and holding each other accountable. I think I heard clearly that we don't tolerate violation of our norms, that violation breaks trust. As a board, we value development and continuous improvement. In fact, that's one of our goals, as we strive to serve our stakeholders more effectively, and that we hold ourselves to the highest standards of conduct and respect of our elected office and as stewards of public trust. And so because of that conversation, we felt we needed to affirm our norms. We made the few changes that I noted, and we felt that we wanted to take a vote, that we uphold these and agree to them, and we'll do our level best to abide by them. So with that, I would open it up to any of the comments from board members about the norms.
Yeah, there's a few comments I'll make. I am voting no because I come from a different perspective on how the board should operate. I think some of what has been normal for the board in the past hasn't been actually good for education in our district. And that past is why I ran and was elected. The community, through elections, sets the board norms and the board makeup. I want good relations with my fellow board members, and most of these norms could be fine if they were universally enforced. But a board member's job is to serve the public, and that comes first. And I don't think our goal should be to control each other's behavior, and I don't think that the board has the authority to tell a board member how to act, since we answer to the public.
Any other comments or questions? Is there a motion to approve the norms?
So moved.
Second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with directors Rotland, Ressler, Godwin, Malone, and Eystone voting yea and Director Hemingway voting nay.
Thank you. Moving on to the sale of the $9,085,000 of school infrastructure sales service and use of tax revenue bonds series 2018. That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is. In the board packet, you have a series of documents, legal in nature, that need your approval. We have Suzanne Gerlach from PFM here tonight to provide a little bit more insight into the process and how the bids were received and that type of thing. So I'll turn that over to Susan.
Thank you. Good evening, board. So this
series of bonds is to finance the balance of the facility master plan to be paid for by the statewide penny funds, as well as to pay for the Twain Elementary addition. So this will be the last time for the current facility master plan that we're planning to go to borrow against the statewide penny fund, the SAVE fund. Through the process, we received 12 different proposals from 8 different firms. In this loan process, they're allowed to give us different terms and propose different terms, and we thought that the most favorable terms and the best interest rate was received from First Internet Bank Corp at a rate of 3.30%. The range was everywhere from 3.3, I think, all the way up to 4.31%. So quite a large range of bids in this. Some of those had different call dates, different term options, but to maintain flexibility for the district and to also receive the lowest interest rate, we are recommending that the board approve these bonds awarded to First Internet Bank Corp at a true interest cost of 3.3%.
Questions on the recommendation?
You might find it interesting to note that just in the time period in which our bids were put out for bid, which was about 30 days, interest rates went up by about, 20-some basis points? Almost 30 basis points, so 1/4% just in that time period. So it reflects the changing economy that we face as well as a school district, as well as we may face individually if we were to go out and borrow on our own and that type of thing. So that's one of the things, and that reflects in the difference in those rates, the spread in those rates, because those bidders look at us differently because of the changing economic environment.
Yeah, there was a Fed Reserve meeting, and we all know that the Fed's raised rates last time, so that was pretty much that 25 basis points.
Yep.
So.
I move that we approve the presented resolutions for the sale of the bonds as indicated in the packet.
Second.
Okay, I'm ready to vote.
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Next up is the resolution to set a hearing date for the sale disposal of school property at City High. Any comments, questions?
I'll just say that I spoke, this happened before many of you were on the board, and it was a situation that we had some homeowners that weren't the happiest, and the ones that I spoke to were very happy with how this was resolved, and compliments should go to Craig and to Dwayne for the actions that they did. This was a situation that I have heard. I tried to contact everyone, and I'm surprised at how many people are no longer in the phone book when I tried to track these people down. But the one person I spoke to said that without exception, everyone was happy with how this worked out, and that we took a bad, administration and staff took a bad situation and corrected it, and everyone's very happy with it, so they should be complimented.
Jeff Barnes was our liaison through the district. He did a terrific job of managing the personalities and the homeowners, and we resolved the water runoff issue.
Correct.
And we straightened out the fence, so that's the whole purpose of this action.
And some of the concerns about the trees have been corrected, so it's, it was very, very well handled.
And I just want to echo what Phil said. I remember we had some very unhappy homeowners when this first came up, so I too appreciate you all working with them and getting a resolution that everybody is on board with.
And good fences make happy neighbors.
So I move that we approve the resolution to set the hearing date for the sale disposal of the school property at City High.
Second.
Okay, I'm ready to vote.
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. Next up is the RAM update. I think Amy? Mm-hmm.
So tonight, I was asked to provide what staffing looks like for next year, and I put that in board docs a little while ago. This model is one that we've used the last couple of years. It shows our 3 different categories of our opportunities as defined by the Superintendent Directions 3J6. Next year we'll have 5 buildings in that high opportunity area, 3 in that average area, and then 12 in that low opportunity area. And as you look across, we just let the formula then drive what the staffing looks like. So I put on there some of the caveats, what's not exactly accurate on the sheet. So for example, Wood, it's showing that they would be down 1 FTE from 18 to 17 next year, but considering that their kindergarten number is so close to just adding a couple more kindergarten students, we would be re-awarding that teacher back. We've asked Mr. DeVoke to sit on the 18 allocation for now. Lucas, the last 2 years, has been up in that first category, and so in thinking through that, we saw their demographics start to change pretty significantly, and thus just determined to move them down in that middle category. Because of that, you would see that last year they had 23 staff awarded. The model is showing 20, and even more recently it's showing it back to 21 and being a few students in there creating that to go back. But we've asked Mr. Turnus just to reduce by 1, so providing more of a soft kind of glide path into that RAM 2 model. The other one that's on there that I noted in board docs was Penn Elementary, and Christy is showing that they should be down 2 FTE, and we've only asked her to reduce 1, and that's based on what we saw happen there last summer. We think we grew by about 60 students over the course of the summer. So it's hard to have that crystal ball. We certainly don't want to be taking staff away who are typically our younger, more inexperienced staff, putting them in a different building and then having to pop open and hire an FTE at the very end. This will not be what it looks like ultimately in August or in September when we come back to do that board report, because of course we're going to have people be moving away and then coming into the district as well. But that gives you a pretty decent snapshot, at least where the principals, what they had in their hands last as far as FTE. So with that, I would entertain any questions.
I have a few questions. So Lincoln and Mann next year being together, how will that work based on how you have this all laid out, because they're in the same building? So are they keeping them students separate?
Yes, good question, Paul. They are. So in fact, I think they're staffed with 13 and 12 sections respectively right now, and we do feel like we have space for 25 sections. Their enrollment has continued to. Their enrollment has continued to teeter a little bit too, and so we're watching that closely. But right now the intent is to have the K2 students, or the PK2 students, in Mann's case they have PK on that bottom floor, and grades 3 through 6 on the top floor, with each building kind of inhabiting their side of the hallway.
And my other question is, looking at a school like Twain on the first one there are 57 students in the kindergarten. I think history has shown that they usually get more there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to have to add another section there, I guess my question would be, how would you fit it into that school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we're tight with space, certainly. So some of those things that we would have shared with you earlier, could we find another temporary space, outside of that school setting? Would we have to look at reducing a PK classroom? We're already trying to make concessions for how to move people around a little bit, given that room that we are going to build in the courtyard won't be ready until December. So the other thing that we could do is suspend the RAM in that case, or award the FTE, but allow that person to float between classrooms. And so we've awarded the FTE, and they would help reduce class sizes for reading and math, small group instruction.
So you'd also still be faced with this base issue, right? Where that teacher would.
Right, she would just float. She wouldn't necessarily have her own classroom.
So you would still have all the students in the same classroom,
Yeah.
but splitting them out, which isn't necessarily ideal either.
Right.
I have one other question, but if you have one, go ahead.
Go ahead.
My other question is on Longfellow. So just when the new space opens, maybe I just would like to know, when we approved the plans, I seem to remember that there was more classrooms coming on board there than we had necessarily in the past, with the way that the library was laid out or whatever it was. Is there space, is there going to be space at Longfellow for things? I guess is more my question, based on their breakdown of staff. Like, what's the school look like there?
So in addition to those 14 classrooms, there's 2 behavior-focused classrooms with that building, as well as Wendell Johnson Preschool. We had moved out to the new Hoover building, and they'll be moving with Longfellow back into their building. So that's 2 preschool classrooms as well. So we have 4 classrooms being utilized that way in addition to the 14 that you see here. And then, of course, we would have our resource special education teachers. We'll have an ELL staff member next year for the first time there as well, but they would need a tinier space.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So Amy, I appreciate that these aren't the final numbers, so please understand my questions accordingly. So I looked in this lowest tier here of opportunity gap barriers, and in the schools down there, there's some really low class sizes, and as I looked at them, I can see that the reason they're so low is because if you don't keep them at that number, then they'll be above what the chart says it's supposed to be. However, when I looked at all of when I looked at several of them, not all of them, but the cohort is small enough that if you took away a teacher, we would only be 1 student over what the chart says. And then I looked at the achievement gap between those schools and some of the other schools, like Lucas and Coralville Central, that have pretty big gaps in their achievement. For example, 5th grade, Lincoln's going to have a class of 15, 2 classes of 15 students. Coralville Central and Lucas are both going to have classes much larger than that. However, Lincoln's math proficiency is 42% higher than Coralville Central's. Yeah. It's 35% higher than Lucas's. And I'm wondering, and I understand you've probably done that because that's what the chart says to do, and I respect that. However, I guess what I'm wondering is, would the board support the superintendent directions being viewed as best case scenario? However, when it makes sense, looking at where the needs are, can we go outside of this roadmap that we have here? I'm wondering how the board feels about that.
I guess I have a couple comments on that, because this is a bigger discussion than just how Lori brought it up, because I think some of the testing and the way that it's done on here may be not just representative in numbers. So, I do have a wife that teaches, and when I talk to her about this stuff with kindergarten teacher, what her kids learn, she gave me an earful of stuff about the tests. But back to your point about the superintendent directions, I think that they're just directions for him to follow. I mean, if it has to be, I think he has the discretion to go above and or below the numbers, and it's obvious on here because there's a lot of belows and there's a couple aboves. So I think that if that's needed, then I don't see that that's an issue.
So given that, then my personal recommendation, I realize I'm just one person, would be to move that 5th grade teacher from Lincoln and make that one section of just 31 students, and move that to one of the other schools that has very large 5th grade classes and could use that because their scores demonstrate scores that clearly aren't perfect in their in their measurement, but nonetheless they are scores that we're looking at. The reading proficiency gap was quite a bit different also for these particular 3 schools. And then I looked at that also, just between 1st graders at Wickham and Coralville Central. I looked at Lucas and Lemmy, They each have a class, one that's real high, one that's real low, and I think there could be some wiggle room if we would be willing to allow you to take that max number for low opportunity gaps and go even just one student more. So that would be my thought. I'm just one person. It's just really hard to see that small of a class size in a school that's already, in the case of Lincoln, they're at 94% proficiency for reading and 91% proficiency for math. And then we've got schools that are, in the 30s in math, higher for reading. But
so what makes this work difficult is, we're staffing based on formula given in that superintendent directions. And typically how we've applied this the last couple of years is anytime a building's tipping over, we've been in a position where we've awarded that FTE. I think maybe that first year I was here, we maybe awarded a half-time teacher, but we've been awarding a full-time teacher. So for us then to think about that added element of the academic piece, I would really encourage the board, if that's something you would want to think about, is to go back and put that in your superintendent directions. Because what will happen in August is people will understand what the RAM is supposed to be allocating, and if we're over, we're going to hear that. And so I just think it's fair to the public for them to also understand all those factors that we're looking at. I know in the past you've also mentioned mobility, so it's a lot easier for us to operate via formulas, and if you're giving us that flexibility, that's great. And the language does say aspirational, but we know what August will be like, whether it's staff or community or parent pressure too to do this. The other tricky thing to think about, and I'll just advocate for our buildings that are in this higher RAM, is 30 students is a lot of students in an elementary classroom. In fact, as we've been having, different budget discussions and things, I was just really yearning to understand where were we right before we implemented this RAM. And just to remind everybody, we were staffing our buildings district-wide at 24 K2 and 28 3-6. That was just applicable to everybody. The other thing I would talk about is if we moved all of our buildings, and this would be a higher student to staff ratio than we had lived with in the past, but to what RAM, that low level RAM is, with staffing at K2 at 26 and 3-6 up to 30, we would save, I think it's 25 or 35 FTE. Not that I am encouraging that. It would be about 23 FTE. And if you think about an average teacher being $80,000 or $85,000, that's about a $2 million savings there. So many things to think about. We want to get this right. You can see when you go back over to the assessment data that our schools that are sitting with that RAM staffing model in that high opportunity gap area are making their biggest gains. So it's hard to think about reallocating when we've been in the infancy of this model as well, given what we're seeing there. And those are the areas, of course, that we're hoping to see the biggest gains. Not that we don't want to see those gains everywhere. So I would just encourage the board that if you want to go back and think about superintendent directions, I think it would be behoove and be best for all of us to have that clarity in the superintendent directions. Otherwise, it's hard to go back into this document and start to pick, well, which building is just slightly over. And given where you're sitting with 30 in a classroom, I think it's hard to ask that. I
don't disagree at all. I mean, this is why I said what I said earlier, that I think, our classes are far too big. Mm-hmm. They are. And I agree, 31 students is definitely too many. However, it's hard to see 27 students at Lucas when their proficiency is quite a bit lower than Lincoln.
Agree. So, yeah, wish we could staff everybody at the high opportunity range. Other questions?
Yeah, on the math scores on the attachment here. For the district for 17-18. For the exception of the, in case 6, for the Asian students, which maintained the same proficiency from fall to spring, everyone went down. Mm-hmm. And some, the Black and African American proficiency started off at 34 and ended at 30, which means 70% of our Black and Hispanic students in K through 6 aren't proficient. Math is the universal truth of the universe, and what opportunities are, I mean, obviously there are a lot of opportunities there. Can you explain why we're not being able to, and the Hispanic students are ended up the year at started at 44 and ended at 32. What can we do to correct that?
Yeah, so I would just share a few insights, and that is this is the first time we've moved to this universal screener, A-Math. It's part of the FAST assessment suite. It is a more broad measure of math, and so where our FAST, early reading, and CBM reading are kind of a quick dipstick, this A-Math screener is more universal, where students are hitting a lot more of the standards. When I think about where we're at with our Iowa assessment scores, grades 3, 5, we typically are seeing around 70% of our kids proficient. So when you look at that overall percentage at 62% at the end of the year, that's lower. Some things I wonder about are the alignment to the Common Core state standards. We know the Iowa assessment hasn't been aligned, and there's work that's going on behind the scenes to get that test, our new test, better aligned to the state standards. So one thing I'm wondering about is this test simply better aligned, and we need to catch up to the alignment of the standards. We've implemented the Envisions math curriculum now. I think we're in year 3, and I would say that we continue to look at how to bolster that math program. So not only are we implementing this universal math screener 3 times, when our students are falling out, just like with reading, over 2 testing periods, they're assigned an intervention and then are progress monitored. The difference with our progress monitoring is that they're progress monitored once every 2 weeks instead of once a week. We just don't feel like that progress monitoring needs to happen that often with math. So this year we've provided additional professional development to our teachers about interventions that their kids could be involved in or needed to be involved in. There was no question about who was going to get the intervention. You had to assign a child to an intervention if they were non-proficient twice. So we feel like we're making some good strides by implementing a new math universal screener, implementing a new progress monitoring measure, which is also A-Math, every other week for kids that are non-proficient, attaching them all to interventions in the system, and then training our staff up on what those interventions are. Our work will continue then next year to be not only to continue to train teachers on these additional interventions, but also then look at classroom or class-wide interventions. So if you have a grade level or if your classroom is at less than 60% proficient, we would expect that you're also adding a class-wide intervention. That just means that not enough kids. Our target is 80%, and if you're below 80%, we need to go in during core instruction, not just during intervention time. And that's why I think we're getting the success that we're seeing in reading, because we're applying all those skills and strategies with what I'm talking about with math to reading. We're also increasing our instructional minutes next year in mathematics. Typically, we've been around about 75 minutes with core instruction plus about a 15-minute intervention block. All grade levels will be up around an hour and a half, if not a little bit more, to provide that core instruction as well as interventions for students that are non-proficient. So we're doing our best to try to reverse this. I would say I can't answer why we see the dip in scores until we have some more trend line data to see if that's pretty typical year in and year out, given that this is the new math assessment. I just would encourage us always to triangulate data. So while we're excited about what we're seeing with the early reading and the CBM reading and FAST, we also know that we want that to be, to see that same increase coming in the fall with Iowa. Well, next year it'll be in the spring with the new assessment, as well as what we're seeing in A-reading. So our A-reading measure, which is the measure that has replaced DRA, still part of the FAST assessment suite, is showing our students a little bit lower overall reading proficiency than our other measures, early reading and CBM reading. We always want to be asking ourselves questions about what's the difference in the test? What are the students asked to do in this test versus these other kinds of tests that they're taking? So it's a really long-winded answer, but those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Well, no, I appreciate it. And if I can kind of boil it down a little bit, one of the things you were saying is we're increasing the time, the exposure. Are we sure that it's the right curriculum?
It's a good question. We put a lot of money into that investment. So again, the most important thing to do would be to follow what we see with what's happening in our individual classroom situations and try to beef up that curriculum with additional supplemental support as a class-wide intervention. All students in that class would be getting that in addition to their intervention block time. But we, have carefully orchestrated protocols and procedures that tip a building or a principal or a classroom teacher or their instructional design strategist when those things need to come into play. Yeah, but good questions. I mean, we're asking ourselves that, and that's why we're trying to make these changes in math, because we just haven't been happy with what we've seen over the last couple of years.
Right, and because if you're spending more time on a curriculum that's not successful, no, I appreciate your answer and that. Thank you.
Amy, I have one other question. I'm wondering, as parents come to you with requests for voluntary transfer, do you look at the individual class, the individual grade, the individual class when you decide whether a student is permitted to go in, and then also look at the school that they are coming from as to whether you're going to approve that transfer or not?
We simply look at space. Sometimes we're tipped off to the fact that there might have been attendance issues. Let's say that, remember, they're not on a grandfathered anymore necessarily unless they're prior to year 2014, 2015. So for those voluntary transfers, the students that have been there long term, we are checking in with the building principals with what we're approving in the lottery. If there's space, we certainly think about the attendance records on the students and whether they would be better served in their home school, if that would help with the attendance issue. Okay. But to the level of, are we looking at the academic piece?
No, not the academics. I'm just thinking, in particular, Corvallis Central and Wickham have a lot of students going from Corvallis Central to Wickham, and then in first grade, Wickham has a really low first grade class size. Wickham or Corvallis Central has a very high, and I'm wondering if I off the top of my head, I can't do the math, but if say 3 students had been told no, you can't go, then that would have put the Wickham class size larger, because then it wouldn't have tipped the scale to where they need another teacher, and it would have allowed Corvallis Central to have that teacher, because then they'd still have those students.
So we're simply awarding based on space and attendance issues. So we're not looking to whether the building that they're coming from could also take or keep those students. We're not looking at that. We're surely looking at the RAM and what the model calls for and if there's space. And we don't fill it all the way to the tippy top until we get closer to the beginning of the school year.
Okay. I just might ask that, when you look at these super low FRL schools, if you are close to where you could get by with a smaller number of sections, to me, it would make sense to say then, no, a transfer can't come into that grade, because that's going to tip them over to needing another teacher, and then they're going to have a really small class size, which isn't fair to the other schools that have higher FRL.
We won't put them in a position to increase FTE.
Okay. Thank you.
And just follow up kind of what to Phil's comment about curriculum, and I actually think that this testing topic would be a good topic for our education committee to actually kind of see actually see a test. So as I mentioned when I was talking to my wife, she's telling me that kindergartners, they're asked questions like, what number's in the tenths when the number's 986? Well, they only learn up to 20. So for them to go that high, they may be no idea what they're doing. Or what time, ask the question like, what is the time on the clock? Well, they're not taught time, so that would be a question that they would get wrong. Also, the way that the test is administered by school or class is maybe even a little different. Some people go into the computer lab, some people are one-on-one. You can't necessarily help the child, but you have more time with them to explain, I guess. And then there's another random example too, is like the math for kids may be presented as what is 3 plus 2 equal, and it's shown vertically, but they teach it horizontally. So, that just goes more to like Phil's question about, is the curriculum lined up with what the testing is. So I think it'd be really good actually, having those examples given to me help me realize maybe some of the pitfalls that the testing may have. So to see it or have it done possibly at an education committee would be a good use of our time.
That's a really good point. And one thing I'm reminded of that I didn't say around AMath is that it's computer adaptive. So the kids get a series of questions, and then it's either going to kick them up to harder questions or, have them ask them previous grade level questions. So a question that might pop up like, whoa, they get asked that in kindergarten? Well, maybe that kiddo had been answering successive questions, right? And they're getting those kinds of questions. One caveat I wanted to share, just because I want to do it in the vein of transparency, is back to our reading scores that I don't feel like I'm getting to highlight enough. With the early reading and CBMR scores, where you see us having gone from 71% proficient to 74 to 76% proficient, we're ecstatic, especially what we're seeing with some of our subgroups, particularly our African American kiddos there. But the one thing I wanted to share is the first 2 years that we were administering the FAST assessment, it was housed in Iowa Tier. If you remember, Iowa Tier was having all those issues, and sometimes it was working. So the state got out of that data warehouse, and they simply are using FastBridge. That's the company that makes the product. Well, because of that, we had to go with whatever FastBridge utilized in the way of rules and the way they did things, not the way of the Eli legislation in Iowa Tier. So a group that used to be counted, and they would have been counted as non-proficient in Iowa Tier, would have been our special education kiddos that are taking the alternative assessment. And FastBridge doesn't allow us to take them out. So FastBridge just simply doesn't count them as having been tested. So if you think about the federal law that no more than 1% of our population should be on alt assessment, if you roughly think about that, and even just did the math of taking 1% off of the 76, we'd still have seen a gain this year if we would have included those kiddos and said they were non-proficient. So we're probably closer to about 75% proficient than the 76, but that's how the system is pulling the data now. But I thought I should share that.
Hey, Amy, one follow-up to what you just said about the math, the adapted math. So for example, if a school was at 41% in the fall, and then they went to 43, and then they dropped to 34 in the spring, is that reflective of them, like, say a student gets their proficient, they're at 41%, but then now they're getting harder questions, so if they miss those questions and that drops their number down, or does it go back to what they know? Did you understand what I'm saying?
I don't know where the test asks them to start either, so I will have to lean on Diane to share that. Sorry, okay. Paul. We can talk about that at Board Education Committee meeting.
Yeah. No comments, questions? That was a really good discussion. Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, Director Liaison reports. Anything that directors would like to highlight? It was a busy month or so. Hearing none. Agenda setting for the 26th. So the first topic, though.
Before you move on, sorry. There's one. So I did participate in the Get Moving for Health and Kids event, which is the 5K run, walk, kids track and field events. And I just wanted to point out that they did make mention there that this was their highest money that they have raised ever, and that they actually think they raised more money than the Run for the Schools this year.
Wow.
So, and that's all going towards the Healthy Kids Initiative versus spread out necessarily to all.
Anything else folks would like to highlight? Thanks, Paul. Agenda setting. First question is work session on June 19th. We had talked preliminarily about having a work session focused on our attendance area work. I guess question for the board, do we want to have that work session? We will not yet have the new data that Adam's putting together for us on the 19th. I think that's coming on the 26th, yes. There was some ideas about, are there some other smaller topics that we could address to use the time and keep us moving forward? I think Lori had sent a note to that effect asking for input from board members. I don't think she got a lot. And so the question for the group is, how do we want to use that time, if at all? I'll just say I am going to be out of town next Tuesday. I just learned today I have to go on a work off-site meeting. So I will not be here, but I would like to ask board members what you'd like to use that time for, if anything.
I also will not be here. That's the only week I'll be gone this summer. But I think I've said it before, I would prefer to wait for maps, because I think we'll just talk in circles until we get maps.
And I'm sorry, I have a work commitment that night, so I won't be in attendance on the 19th now either. Schedule change.
Well, that may take care of it right there. We have a quorum still, if JP can be there.
I think he might still be out of town. I could check, but.
No, he was going to be back.
Is he back then?
Yeah,
Okay.
he's back then.
I'm available, but it's not well attended.
And just to be clear, we could have had more information for us at that meeting if we would have wanted it, but there was just very little response from the board on that. So it sounds like folks would rather wait.
I think between needing new maps and three of us not being available to attend, I think it's probably better to focus on the 26th. So going to the 26th, the regular meeting, community comment, consent agenda. Actually, there's really nothing else slotted in for the 26th for policy action. I don't know if we have any other topics that we want to see on the 26th. We could make our regular meeting very, very short and put all of our time and energy into the work session.
I do wonder, and maybe this goes on a work session, but since policy and governance isn't meeting over the summer, and I feel like my personal opinion is this class size stuff is needing to be dealt with. I mean, we can put it on the policy and governance committee agenda, but it won't be till, fall, and class sizes will already be set by then.
Are you talking about the superintendent direction?
The superintendent
Yep,
directions,
yep.
the 3J, whatever
Yep,
they
yep,
are.
yep.
So would we like to just make a few wording tweaks at a work session or at a board meeting? Or do we want to just put that off for the committee to address?
I definitely don't want to do it at the board table because I think it's been our norm to not write policy at the board table. But if we had to discuss it at the work session, I'm okay with having the discussion.
So maybe at the 26th work session. Okay. So
If there's support for making changes before it would go to committee.
I think it's worth a conversation. I think it's worth to have that on the agenda for the 26th work session. Okay, so any other, for the regular board meeting, any other ideas for, again, I think if we have a pretty quick and rapid regular meeting, we can make some good progress in the work session.
I just have, is there, if not at this meeting, maybe the first meeting in July, a possibility to get an update from the calendar committee on if they've been looking at adding, the possibility of us adding support for some of the religious holidays that we had students come in and talk about?
I don't know who from admin might be able to know whether we could have an agenda item on the 26th on that.
I think that would be Kingsley. We can check with him. I mean, if you want to put it on the agenda item, I'm
If not the
sure we can probably
26th,
have something by then.
July, that would be great.
Right.
It'd be more of a presentation item as opposed to action,
Yeah.
so
that
the
would
first
be-
meeting in July would
Let's do that.
follow our pattern anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Ruthina, for keeping us honest on that and closing the loop and continuing the focus.
I'm sorry?
You were wanting just an update?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's go to the work session then on the 26th. We will be talking about the new maps for attendance area, of course. We just added an item around class size and discussing language changes to superintendent direction, what is it, 2J?
3J6.
3J6, I think.
3J6, sorry, couldn't remember.
Weighted resource allocation only.
Yep. Anything else that we'd want to see at that work session?
I don't know that it needs to go on that one, but I was looking back at my notes, realizing that in February, we were told that we would be given a roadmap on the LGBTQ work plan, and we did discuss it at the Education Committee, but we did not receive a roadmap at that point. And one of the speakers tonight did ask us why we aren't doing more with that. I don't know if the board wants to try and tackle that as well during the summer and as well as everything else that we're doing, or if we want to put that off till fall.
And maybe another question for Kingsley to give us an update on what's happening there. Whether, and so that it could also be the first meeting in July. So we'll just have Kingsley on the agenda for. Okay, is that reasonable?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, at that point in February, we had said we'd put it on a work session, and I don't know that it matters if it's a work session or meeting, but.
I mean, let's get an update first and then decide where the roadmap is, what the status of it is, and then decide if we are ready for a work session. So anything else for that 26th work session? Hearing none. It's attendance area, new maps, 3J6, sorry. And then we have closed session with the superintendent to go over his evaluation. I think that's it for the 26th. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.